Before we get going, today's shir is dedicated in the memory of, it's sponsored by Mark and Deborah Zohar for the yard sites of Mark's parents, Kalman Chaim Ben Tzvi, the second of Av, and Esther Bat Moshe, the fourth of Av. And as usual, the entire series is dedicated in memory of Elisheva Frist, Elisheva Sima Bat Zalman, and I acknowledge the presence of Hallie the entire year, and I thank you for the dedication. And it should be a year of Bsorot Tovot. Believe me, we need it. Okay, it's the last shir of the Zman, but I mentioned already last week the Rav's allergic reaction to Siyum Masechet, the last, because Torah has no ending. So you're all cordially invited next week at home on Wednesday at 9:15 to crack a sefer, and you can still learn. You're allowed to do. There's no prohibition of Torah study when there's no sessions here at the OU program. We're going to do something I think is very appropriate for the 3 weeks and the 9 days, and that is the last two lines of the Yigdal. We're almost done with the Yigdal, and the last two of the Anima Amins, and the last two of the Rambam from his introduction to the last chapter of Masechet Sanhedrin, Chelek, Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chelek L'Olam Haba, and he has the fundamental number 12 and fundamental number 13, which are all the same thing. So let's look at the Yigdal, the last two lines on the page. Some of you have the stapled copy, which is the original, and I only had 13 from last week's collection, so I copied the first page and the last page. Some of you have one page and a first page and a last page, and that's going to be good enough for today. Yishlach leketz hayamin mishichenu liftot mechakei ketz yeshuato. Kadosh Baruch Hu will send in the end of days. So ketz hayamim is a nice biblical way, a nice poetic way of saying acharit hayamim. Acharit hayamim is mentioned in Parshat Balak. We just read it 2 weeks ago. And it's mentioned also in Parshat Nitzavim. So the concept is also mentioned in Parshat Vayechi. Yaakov Avinu says, "Heyasvu v'agida lecha et asher yikra etchem ba'acharit hayamim." He gathers all his sons and he wants to reveal to them how things are going to end. Of course, he doesn't really spell it out. You expect to get a date and a place and a person, but you don't get that. So Chazal say in Parshat Vayechi that Kadosh Baruch Hu denied Yaakov Avinu from revealing the details because he didn't want those details to be revealed. That Am Yisrael would continue in an unknown and uncharted course. Nevertheless, the Ramban points out that there are elements of Acharit Yamim in the context of the brachot that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that Yaakov Avinu gives to his sons before his passing away. The Rav Shamshon Nufal Hirsch speaks about the fact that in order to have a healthy society in Eretz Yisrael, you have to have many, many different components, and each one of the Shvatim occupied a different aspect of what life, communal life, and agricultural life, and military life, and political life, and all that is in the brachot. And he says that Rav Hirsch says this, it's very nice to have a nation that will all be engaged in Torah study, except that's not how you build a state. You have to have all the others. And yeah.
So why in the middle of done did he do it?
Why, I'm sorry?
Why in the middle of the bracha to done
Yeah.
does he say Lishulas Chagidis Hashem?
Okay, that's a Parshanut question. Okay, I can't answer this now because the different explanations of why specifically for one Shevet Yaakov Avinu received that. I'm sorry for deferring the question, but it's going to sidetrack, and I don't have all the Parshanim in my fingertips to even respond to that. But the idea of the brachot, according to Rav Hirsch, was that it's a spread. There are those who are involved in agriculture, those in commerce, those in international commerce, in terms of Shevet Naphtali, but and there's some involved in leadership, like Shevet Yehuda, and so on. You needed all of those to have a state, and it's possible that to this end, Yaakov Avinu is calling out what Eretz Yisrael should be and what should look like. And one thing is very, very important, because the Rambam tells us in his last two chapters of the Mishneh Torah, which are his last two chapters of the Hilchot Melachim, the laws of monarchy and wars, he speaks about Yemot HaMashiach. and it's the only halachic sefer that actually deals with the era of Messianic times. And it was pointed out already by Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was very much into Mashiach now, that one of the reasons that they say that Lubavitcher wanted people to read regularly the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. He's proposed three chapters a day and you finish in a year, or one chapter a day and you finish it in 3 years. You'll always get to see that the laws of the era of Mashiach are just another extension of the laws of Torah today. It's not like all of a sudden the curtain's going to close on the world and now a new curtain opens up and it's the world of Mashiach. No, it's going to be an extension. And the Rambam says that Olam kiminago noheg. And just as you have cars and trains and planes and boats, you're going to have that in Yemot HaMashiach too. And if you have cell phones now, you're going to have cell phones in Yemot HaMashiach. And we're going to be technologically advanced. We're not going back to the days of Har Sinai with Moshe Rabbeinu and Am Yisrael sitting there with tents and so on. That's not going to be the case. But Olam kiminago noheg. And therefore, the description of what statehood would be is so relevant in the description of Rav Shamshon Hirsch of Parshat Vayechi that you can say that Yaakov Avinu had a glimpse of Acharit HaYamim in the end of days. So Acharit HaYamim is there 3 times in the Torah without details. We know one thing in Parshat Nitzavim, that it's going to have something to do with returning to Eretz Yisrael. V'shav Hashem Elokecha shvutcha v'yirichamecha v'shav v'kibetzcha mikol ha'amim. There's going to be kibbutz goliot, something, we're going to come back to Eretz Yisrael. That's there in the Chumash. And then, of course, when you start opening up the Nevi'im, then it's expanded. Whether you're talking about Yeshayahu, practically all the book, or Yirmiyahu, some of it, and some of the other Nevi'im, Yecheskel, half the book for sure, are talking about Yemot HaMashiach. And they're talking about Zechariah Navi and so on. They're talking about an era of shalom in the world, and so on. So Yishlach le'ketz hayamin mishichenu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu at the end of days is going to send his anointed one, who we call the Melech HaMashiach. And I'll just point out that some have it le'ketz hayamin with a nun sofit, which was based on a pasuk in Daniel where he mentions ketz hayamin, but you have to realize he's speaking Aramaic Eretz Yisraeli. And Aramaic Eretz Yisraeli, the mem sofit flips into a nun sofit. But yamin and yamin is the same thing. It doesn't mean right wingers. It doesn't mean that God is going to send the right wingers, and although to bat righty to be the Melech HaMashiach. Then that's not the point. The point is Acharit Hayamim. Ketz Hayamim or Ketz Hayamin is the exact same thing. Liftot mechakei Ketz Yeshuato. To redeem those who are waiting for the end for his help. Now let's just look at the last line, which is Tchiat HaMeitim, resurrection. Meitim Yechayel Berov Chazdo, God is going to revive the dead. Baruch Adei Ad Shem Tilato, is forever to bless God. Baruch Adei Ad Shem Tilato is an acknowledgement that only HaKadosh Baruch Hu has no end. Has eternity. I believe I mentioned already that when we talked about the eternity of the universe, those philosophers who believed it, and the Rambam telling us that only God is Kadmon L'chol Davar Asher Nivra, Kadosh Baruch Hu is the only one who's eternal. This brought about an idea. It's not a absolute dogma from Sinai, but one of the Chachamim and I even quoted my great teacher, Professor Mayor Hershkowitz, who said that the world's going to come to an end after 6,000 years. And the idea was, it doesn't mean it has to happen after 6,000 years, 7,000th year of Mashiach, and then all of a sudden God pushes the reset button. No. The idea is that only HaKadosh Baruch Hu has an eternal future. Anything that has to do with the created world must necessarily have an end. That's why, if you have an electrical appliance at home and you see it's going, it's blinking out, it's okay, because that's what happens. Not everything lives forever. So your microwave is not going to live forever, and your toaster is not going to live forever, your refrigerator is not going to live forever, and believe it or not, neither are we. So only HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Haya, Hoveh, V'yeh. So the Rambam, this poem ends with Baruch Adei Ad. Adei Ad is forever, Shem Tilato. But human beings not. So I just want to begin with Tchiat HaMeitim and then go back to Yemot HaMashiach and end on a high of Yemot HaMashiach and see where we're moving in this direction. But the Rambam got in trouble. He got into trouble with regard to his belief or not believing, perhaps, in Tchiyat HaMetim. Look at the last page, the last line, the very last line of the last page. It says, Yesod HaShlosha Asar, the 13th principle. If you have the one page, it's the second page on the bottom. If you have the staples, it's just the last source on the bottom. It's got to be the end. And it says, in the last line, the second word of the second line, it says, Vayesod HaShlosha Asar Tchiyat HaMetim. The 13th is resurrection of the dead. Ukvar bi arnuha. And I already talked about it. Now here, the printer in the Rav Kapach edition realized that he had so little to say about the 13th, he didn't even give it a special paragraph. If you just look, just scroll up, you see Hayesod HaShnei Masar, the 12th, Vayesod HaCharsar, the 11th, Vayesod HaSiri, the 10th, and so on, so on, so on, so on, so on, so on. Each one deserves a new paragraph. So why didn't the printer in the Rav Kapach edition simply give us a new paragraph with one line, Vayesod HaShlosha Asar Tchiyat HaMetim? He continues it in the 12th. Why does he do that? So, just like a drasha on the printer. Why did the printer do this? The printer did it because Tchiyat HaMetim and Yemot HaMashiach are first cousins. They go together. There is a real connection. Not only is there a connection, but according to Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, Tchiyat HaMetim will occur at the time of Yemot HaMashiach. It was what they saw in the predictions of Tchiyat HaMetim, perhaps in Yecheskel, where it talks about Atzamot Yeveshot, the dry bones, and people think that's a comics in the Jerusalem Post, but it's actually a chapter. It is, I know, but it's a chapter in Yecheskel, where he talks about after the Milchama Gog Magog in chapter 38 and chapter 39, he has the parak of the Atzamot Yeveshot, and you see the bones are coming alive once again. The way many of the Parshanim explain that vision of the dry bones coming alive is not necessarily the prediction for Tchiyat HaMetim, but rather the revival of Am Yisrael. And if you've seen, and I'm sure you have, pictures of heaps of bones when the Americans and Russians entered into the camps, and they photographed what this was, and then you take a look at who we are and what we are today in Eretz Yisrael, that is the vision of the Atzamot Yeveshot. I mean, those dry bones have come alive, without a doubt. So it's clearly can be seen in the context of a type of homiletical vision of the revival of Am Yisrael. We were down and out, right? Mikimi me'afar dal, me'ashpot yarim evyon, from the dung, from the garbage. We were down and out, and you see HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought us up. So this is something that we talk about. But you can see that chapter, Lamed 39 in Yecheskel, as being a chapter of Tchiyat HaMetim, which is fine. The Chazal struggle in Masechet Sanhedrin to give us allusions, remez, allusions to Tchiyat HaMetim in the Chumash itself. For example, Az Yashir Moshe Uvnei Yisrael. It doesn't say Az Shar Yisrael. Then Am Yisrael sang, because it's clearly in the past. The Torah is reporting that Am Yisrael and Moshe and Bnei Yisrael sang the Shirah. But it says, will sing. Will sing. They're going to sing once again. Mikan l'tchiyat hamitim in the Torah. Yeah, you see an allusion. Or in Parshat Korach, where it talks about the giving of Truma to a Kohen, and the Torah says, you'll give it to Aaron. Aaron dies in the Midbar, in the desert. He never received a kernel of Truma in his life. So obviously the understanding is you give to the Kohanim. And Aaron is just a name dropping, like the Paitanim, the poets, many times when they spoke about Kohanim, they would use the plural Aharonim. Leviim ve'Aharonim b'tzeti mimitzrayim. So it doesn't mean Aaron, it means Kohanim, who are, the continuation of Aaron HaKohen. Because you're supposed to be a Ben Aaron HaKohen to be a Kohen, that's for sure. So the Torah says, you'll give to Aaron the Truma. But the Gemara says, Mikan l'tchiyat hamitim in the Torah. You see, Aaron's going to wake up one day, and it's going to be obviously here in Eretz Yisrael, so we will be able to give him Truma, and obviously it's going to be a long line for people to give to Aaron HaKohen Truma. Why everybody's going to want to give Aaron HaKohen the Truma? And all kinds of allusions in the Chumash, but straight out, you really don't have Tchiyat HaMetim. Now you have two episodes in the Nevi'im, with Eliyahu Navi, with Elisha Navi, Beseda, and however we understand that. The Gemara tells us in the beginning of Masechet Tanit that HaKadosh Baruch Hu maintained 3 keys of opening of certain passages, and one was the key to rainfall, one was the key to childbirth, and one was the key to Tchiyat HaMetim. Okay, so it's almost in one breath. We're putting Tchiyat HaMetim, which is just awesome. You can't even describe how awesome that event is going to look like. With rain, okay, it rains. Rain is pretty natural. And childbirth is also pretty natural, except that childbirth, a little bit more, one can sense that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in the picture. I remember when one of the births of our kids in Beersheba, so we had a lovely Lubavitcher midwife there, Miyaledet, and I asked her after the birth, I said, so how do you feel with the presence of the Shekhinah? So she, what are you talking about? I said, the Gemara says that Kadosh Baruch Hu is here at the time of childbirth. She almost fainted. She was so shook up because she didn't realize, she never heard this before, and here I'm telling her a piece of news that's not small information. That, I said, maybe you should go to the mikveh before you come into the Cheder Leida, because it's the presence of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, and so on. So our daughter, who's a gynecologist and a fertility expert, she's been in the Cheder Leida more than, she said, it's absolutely 1,000% true what Chazal say, that Kadosh Baruch Hu holds the key for childbirth. Because as natural and normal as it is, she said there are a million things that can go wrong. And they usually don't go wrong. They usually don't. Unfortunately, sometimes they do go wrong, and then, thank God, we have medical intervention to try our best to intervene, and sometimes that doesn't even work. But the overwhelming majority of the births go okay. I mean, sometimes a little bit more discomfort, less, and so on. But it's a natural delivery, or it's an intervene. It's a cesarean that we know how to handle it today, and so on. But the Kadosh Baruch Hu is there. Okay, so that's a pretty natural event, even though there's room for a Birkat HaGomel because it's a life-threatening situation even today. But rainfall is a very, very normal and natural event, and so on. And you put that all together with Tchiyat HaMetim. Now, the Chazal knew what they were doing, because if you look at the second bracha of Shmona Esrei, Ata Gibor L'Olam Hashem, Mechayei Meitim Ata Rav L'Oshia. Now we talk about rain, Mashiach V'Ruach Mordech Hashem. But we said Mechayei Meitim Ata Rav L'Oshia. Also, you've just, he revives the dead and gives the rain, right? And Mechalkel Chayim B'Chesed, you make Parnasa, it's also, inscribed on Rosh Hashanah how much you're going to earn, and so on. Mechayei Meitim, Barachamim Somech Noflim, he helps people get up. Rofei Cholim, he cures. Matir Asurim, they're in a bind somewhere. Doesn't have to be jail. Sometimes people are locked into certain scenarios, and a Kadosh Baruch Hu gets them out. These are natural situations where sometimes you do need Kadosh Baruch Hu's help and guiding advice to get out of a certain mess. But it's all together. That becomes the finale of this bracha, and almost you'd think that, okay, it's another thing on the agenda that happens in the world, Tchiyat HaMetim. But it doesn't. It doesn't happen like that. So why do we have the second bracha that we talk about Gvurot? And the purpose of the bracha of Gvurot is to plow the way for some of the brachot in the middle of Shmona Esrei. Because only from Atah Chonein L'Adam Dat until Shomei Tefillah are we requesting. The first 3 brachot are praise, Shevach to Kadosh Baruch Hu. So there's the Shevach that we have an avenue of communication with Kadosh Baruch Hu, which comes through Avotenu, V'zocher Chazdei Avot, Umevigo Levnei V'neihem, and that's why it's a Kelei Avraham, L'kei Yitzchak, L'kei Yaakov. Fine. And the third bracha, HaKadosh, we understand also, we acknowledge the fact that we're standing before Kadosh Baruch Hu. Fine, that's all Shevach. And Ata Gibor is also Shevach. So the Gemara says, Lodam yisader adam shivcho shel makom v'achar kach yitpalel. You should always give a Kadosh Baruch Hu praise before you get to the point. That it's derived from Moshe Rabbeinu, V'etchanan el Hashem beitehi lemor, Ata achilota larot et avdecha et godlecha v'et yodcha chazaka. The beginning of Parshat V'etchanan. So first he spells out all the great things that Kadosh Baruch Hu did, and he gets the point. I'm going to go over the border and come into Eretz Yisrael. So first you begin with Shevach. Okay, so we begin. You're going to talk about Refuah Shlema, Rifa'enu Hashem. You're going to talk about this. You're going to talk about rain, Talam Atal Bracha. So mention that a Kadosh Baruch Hu is the one who gives it. You're not requesting it in Atar Gibor. That's why we're allowed to say Mashiach Baruch Merageshem on Shabbat, where the Shmoneh Esrei does not have direct bakasha, because it's praise. It's praise. Okay, fine, praise. So the great praise showing the Gvurot HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Triat HaMitim. So the question is, why does the Rambam not bother in his introduction to Perek Chelek, where he explains all the 12, and he gets to the 13th, and he says, it's Triat HaMitim, I talked about it already. It's have to say, well, okay, so where did you talk about it? And why was the Rambam, why did he get in trouble? Because it was suggested maybe he actually doesn't believe it. Because you go through the whole Mishnah Torah, and he gives 2 full chapters about Messianic days, not a word about Triat HaMitim, because the Rambam against the Ramban's 100 years later, but the Rambam against that view believes that Mashiach is one thing, and Triat HaMitim is something else way down the line of history, way beyond Yemot HaMashiach. And therefore, it should not be confused at all, and does not say one word about Triat HaMitim in his discussion of Yemot HaMashiach. And so he puts it as a separate ikar. Fine, we understand that. Where in the whole Mishnah Torah he doesn't talk about Triat HaMitim, except for 2 places, as almost a, by the way, where he talks about Shmoneh Esrei and the whole business Shmoneh Esrei, so you can't miss the fact that the second bracha is called Mechayei HaMitim. Fine. So he talks about the bracha of Gevurot. He gives it the nickname Triat Mechayei HaMitim. Fine. So he mentions it. And in Ilchot Tshuva, Perek Gimel, where he's got a list of 24 different categories of people who don't have Olam Haba, he says if you deny Triat HaMitim, HaKofer b'Triat HaMitim. Okay, so it's like Batel B'Shishim. It's like it's thrown into the shissel, with all the other stuff, but there's no discussion about Triat HaMitim at all. So Triat HaMitim, it's actually eclipsed in the Mishnah Torah, and this is what led those in the 13th century to suggest, actually in 12th century, in the Rambam's days, that maybe the Rambam is against it. He got letters from Yemen, and he got letters from Chalab, that what's with Triat HaMitim? And he writes a letter late in life, in 1191. He dies in 1204. Late in life, called Ma'amar Triat HaMitim, and he justifies the whole notion of what Triat HaMitim is all about. And he actually says the following. He says, it's going to be an era that a Kadosh Baruch Hu will choose way deep into the Messianic era, where a Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to revive the dead tzaddikim. Tzaddikim. So first of all, we're not talking about a mass opening of graves of every Jewish cemetery of the world. No. You're going to have to be on the list. And to be on the list, you're going to have to qualify as being a tzaddik. And now comes the big question. Which tzaddikim was he talking about? There's a thing called tzaddik gamur and a thing called tzaddik she'ino gamur. Let's start with tzaddik she'ino gamur. Incomplete tzaddik means that when a Kadosh Baruch Hu looks at the list on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, you're at least 51% in favor in terms of merits, mitzvot, and so on. 51%. That's going to work for Rosh Hashanah. It's going to work because the Kadosh Baruch Hu learned Yoredeya, and acharei rabim lahatot, your majority rules. So if you're 51% in the tzaddik side, you're doing good. You're going to have a year that you're going to live. Then there's a thing called, but the Gemara tells us, that doesn't mean it's going to be a year without suffering. Because the Gemara contrasts the issue of Sefer Iyov. How can you be a tzaddik and suffer? Tzaddik v'ralo. So the Gemara says, tzaddik v'tovlo, tzaddik gamur. If a person is an absolute, unequivocal tzaddik, then he's going to go through life without any suffering. But a tzaddik she'eno gamur is going to be a person who's going to live out his life, but there's going to be bounces, going to be curves and bounces in his life. Tzaddik she'eno gamur, it's going to go with a certain amount of suffering, and so on. The problem is that who's a tzaddik gamur? You're going to have to, maybe one in every generation, maybe. Today, you don't even know that. Then the Gemara talks about the flip side. You see Rishayim today who have a wonderful life. He says that's a Rasha she'eno gamur. That means there must be a redeeming feature in that Rasha. And the Kadosh Baruch Hu is giving him some reward in this world, so that at the end of his life, he's going to have no reward of Olam Haba. And a Rasha gamur is a Rasha she'eno, is a complete Rasha, right? And so on. Fine. So Tzaddik Gamur, maybe just a Tzaddik Gamur will have Triat HaMitim, but that doesn't seem to be the situation. because the Gemara says that Geshem, rain, is for tzaddikim and rishoyim, and Tchiat HaMetim is just for tzaddikim. On this basis, the Rambam says what he says, that it's just for tzaddikim. Now, rainfall, when the Gemara says tzaddikim v'rishoyim, it means everybody. So it includes tzaddik she'eno gamur, and it includes a rasha she'eno gamur. It's everybody. It's the spectrum of humanity and so on. It means you don't have rain on one block where a bunch of tzaddikim live, and the next block where a handful of rishoyim, it doesn't rain in their gardens. You don't have that. When it rains, so everybody's a beneficiary of rain. And if there's a drought, everybody's going to suffer from the drought. So it's across the board, rishoyim and tzaddikim. But Tchiat HaMetim says just tzaddikim. So the impression is it's not just one or two in a generation who qualify as tzaddik gamur, but it means that people are fundamentally good people and so on will have Tchiat HaMetim. But, says the Rambam, they're also going to die. So this is like teasing us. They're going to get up from the grave and live, and then after a certain amount of time, they're going to die again. Why does the Rambam say that? He explains it. Because necessarily something that's mortal has to die. Something that's human has to die. Something that's physical has to die. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu is eternal. And therefore, even with Tchiat HaMetim, doesn't mean it's the end of death. So even though we have a pasuk, Bila hamavet lanetzach, umacha Hashem Elokim me'al kol panim, as if the Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to vanquish the death, and we sing this at the end of the Seder, Ve'ata Kadosh Baruch Hu v'shachat l'malach hamavet. That's the idea of Bila hamavet lanetzach. Rambam qualifies and he says, yeah, there'll be a second chance to live, and it's going to be very miraculous, extremely miraculous, but that person's life is going to come to an end as well, and that's the way it's going to be. So then he says, not only is the person going to die once again, when we talk about Tchiat HaMetim as an era, this is going to be, this is an example of where Kadosh Baruch Hu can defy the rules of nature. And just as we believe that Kadosh Baruch Hu created the world, and creating the world ipso facto means he created the laws of nature, so the mechokek, the one who made the law, can suspend the law. So the reason why no one else can suspend the law of nature is because you didn't have anything to do with creating the law of nature. But the Kadosh Baruch Hu, who created the laws of nature, can suspend it. Rambam says that this ani ma'amin of Tchiat HaMetim simply means that we believe that a Kadosh Baruch Hu can suspend the laws of nature, and it has happened in the past. And you open up a Chumash and you see it, and it has happened here and there in the days of the Nevi'im, and it can still happen. And therefore, he uses Tchiat HaMetim as nothing but an example, a Class A example of a Kadosh Baruch Hu's suspension of laws of nature. Because when somebody dies, law of nature says it's over, and the suspension of that law of nature says that even though the person died, the person may live once again. And the belief in Tchiat HaMetim is a retroactive belief in every single miracle that a Kadosh Baruch Hu performs in the Chumash, from Breshit until Le'enei Kol Yisrael, and afterwards in the days of the Nevi'im, whatever would be considered a supernatural miracle. Any type, if you believe in Tchiat HaMetim, then for sure you believe in Kriyat Yamsuf, and you believe in this, and you believe in that, and so on. Now, even though it was the same Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim that claimed that all the supernatural miracles didn't mean that a Kadosh Baruch Hu created something new for the miracle to happen, but the new miracle was actually anchored in some type of deviation of nature, where normally this wouldn't happen, but a Kadosh Baruch Hu caused something that nature deviated, but it's the natural law, or the deviated natural law, or appended natural law, which is now causing the miracle. He says it with regard to Kriyat Yamsuf. So if you watch CNN and you look at the weather report on CNN, they have what they call extreme weather. So extreme weather is, tornadoes and hurricanes and so on. Extreme weather. Now, extreme weather is natural, even though it's extreme. It's extreme because it happens once in a while, so we call it extreme weather. You know that if you take a pot of water, fill it up to the top, and take a very strong fan and hold it on top of the water. Don't put it in the water, you're going to get electrocuted. But if you hold it on top of the water, you're going to see Kriyat Yamsuf. you're going to see somehow the water split right in front of your eyes because the pressure of the wind of the fan is going to blow apart it may not go all the way to the bottom depending on the strength of the fan, but you can do a laboratory experiment of Kriyat Yamsuf. What does the Torah say in Parshat Beshalach? That Vayolach Hashem ruach kadim kol halayla, that there was a very fierce, strong wind that came and then split the sea. So the Torah is telling us that there was a extreme weather condition that occurred at that moment. So the Rambam says, where was the miracle? The miracle was in the timing. That it happened exactly when HaKadosh Baruch Hu saw that Am Yisrael needed a split Red Sea. So that was the miracle. And I'm just going to digress. The Gemara says that what did HaKadosh Baruch Hu do? What does he do after creation? He went on early retirement, right? So he did hasava mikzoit. He took on a new profession. He became a shatchan. He makes shidduchim. Kadosh Baruch Hu makes shidduchim. And making a shidduch kashe alav kekriyat yamsuf. It's like as difficult as kriyat yamsuf. Now the thing is, you think kriyat yamsuf for us is hard, but for Kadosh Baruch Hu it's nothing. So what's so hard about it? The answer was the timing. A shidduch needs the right timing. And that's what the Chazal say, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew the right timing when to bring a fellow and a young lady together. Because we know of cases where couples have met years before, nothing happened, and somehow they get set up again, or they meet casually again, and they get engaged. Why didn't it happen 5 years before? Kachazeh, the timing wasn't right. The timing, it's all in the timing. Okay, so now you have the reason for the Yesod of Tchiyat HaMeitim. The Rambam says, yes, I believe in Tchiyat HaMeitim, but this is what it's all about. And it's almost, that's it. The man's going to, some will get up and they're going to die again. It's a belief in the ability of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to suspend laws of nature. And that's why he doesn't bother going into great detail, because earlier in his whole introduction to the Chelik, he actually does spend some time explaining just what I just summarized. But let's get back to Mashiach. Right? Mashiach. Right. So, I'll quote Professor Yeshayahu Leibowitz in a line that I say up front, I do not accept what he's saying, but it's an interesting way of saying what he said. He said the belief in Yemot HaMashiach is the most central belief in Yahadut, but oy vavoy if it happens. You have to understand who Yeshayahu Leibowitz was and what that meant by him and so on. He was fearful of what might happen in Yemot HaMashiach. One of the things that he was concerned about was what kind of kippah is Melech HaMashiach going to wear? I mean, he's going to have a black yarmulke, his knitted yarmulke, a white yarmulke, from Esharm. I mean, or no yarmulke, or kippah shkufa. This was Rabbi Levine, the famous Ish Tzaddik Hayah, who said every Jew has a kippah. Some it's a black kippah, some it's a knitted kippah, and some it's a transparent kippah. Kippah shkufa. Every Jew has a kippah. Some kippot you just don't see. That's all. It doesn't mean they don't have a kippah. It is a brilliant idea. A brilliant idea of Avat Yisrael, by the way. It's a brilliant idea of Avat Yisrael. Every Jew has his kippah, and whether you notice it or not is totally irrelevant. The idea of Melech HaMashiach, in order for Melech HaMashiach to be accepted by everyone, so if you take the stand that Melech HaMashiach is going to be a supernatural event, and with it will go other supernatural events like Tchiyat HaMeitim, then Mashiach's going to come down from heaven or something. Beit HaMikdash is going to come down from heaven, which is not so way out in our tradition. Rashi and Tosfot believe that third Beit HaMikdash is going to come down from heaven, and therefore different halachot about building Beit HaMikdash are applicable, and therefore it's going to be such a miraculous event. Everybody's going to put all their hashkafot, all their thoughts that they had on the side, and gravitate to Mashiach and accept him and so on. Except the Rambam doesn't believe all that. The Rambam believes he's going to be a human being, born, he's going to develop, and he's going to be in Eretz Yisrael. The Rambam says that Melech HaMashiach is going to be an Eretz Yisrael personality, and he writes this clearly to Yemen in his Ma'amar, one of his letters, Igeret Hashmad, where he writes there are all kinds of false messiahs jumping around, and Jews need guidance to accept, not to accept, and so on. So in the 12th century, you have many, many false messiahs, And the Rambam says they're all false. One of the reasons is Melech Mashiach has to be Ish Eretz Yisrael. Has to be a person who's grounded in Eretz Yisrael, the whole activity is here in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so the Lubavitchers don't buy that. They don't accept a few things about the Rambam's view. Big time, they don't. What's interesting is that the Rebbe made such a big to-do about the fact that the Rambam talks about 2 chapters of Hilchot Yemot HaMashiach and 2 very essential doctrines of the Rambam. The Chabad just sidestepped. One is that the Mashiach has to be an Eretz Yisrael personality. The Lubavitcher Rebbe was a great person without any doubts. He doesn't need my marks on this one, except that he never was an Eretz Yisrael in his life. So to say he was an Ish Eretz Yisrael, that's clearly not going to work. It's not going to work. And the second is, the Rambam talks about Bar Kochba. He talks about Bar Kochba. And the talking about Bar Kochba is extremely important because the Rambam is actually negating the view that the Messianic days are going to be by some supernatural process. The Rambam believes that it's going to be part of the geopolitical world. It's going to develop. It's going to happen. And the proof is, Rabbi Akiva saw Bar Kochba as Melech HaMashiach. And the Rambam says about Rabbi Akiva, and I can tell you that the Rambam did not give out marks to any of the Chachamim except to Rabbi Akiva. He does it twice. And I mentioned it just the other week. We talked about the contradiction or seeming contradiction between the doctrine of free will and the doctrine of providence, hashgacha. And Rabbi Akiva says 4 words, hakol tzafui v'rishut netuna. And the Rambam says, couldn't have had a better person to say this than Rabbi Akiva. I mean, my gosh, the Rambam doesn't say such a thing about anybody. And he says about Rabbi Akiva that they could not have, the sentence is, harashut netuna, that permission is granted. I'm sorry, hakol tzafui, everything is destined, everything is known by God, everything is known. Nevertheless, permission is granted for you to make a choice. So that's, in 4 words, the Rabbi Akiva put together the contradiction. How can you have free will and providence at the same time? Take a pick. Spinoza from the 16th century in Holland said, we're not going to limit HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So therefore, there must necessarily not be free choice. And others would say, there has to be free choice, but then HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't really know what's going on in the future. And the Rambam rejects both. He says you have to have the Kadosh Baruch Hu is Kol Yachol. He does have the. Last week I talked about it. That the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the concept of time, is not relevant. So therefore, every moment of our time to Kadosh Baruch Hu is Hayah Hoveh V'yes, past, present, and future, and therefore the future as if it happened already, and so on. So here the Rambam is telling us that that the Melech HaMashiach does not have to bring ototum oftim, does not have to bring all kinds of miracles, and his proof is Sharei Rabbi Akiva Chacham Gadol Michachmei Mishnah Haya. He was the greatest. Now again, the Rambam never says anything about any of the other Tanaim to give them a grade. Oh, by the way, he's number 1. He's number 1. But Rabbi Akiva was very special in the Rambam's religious personality. What does Nosei Kelim mean? Nosei Kelim, many times in the yeshiva today, when you say Nosei Kelim, you mean the commentators on the Rambam. The word Nosei Kelim is Tanachic, and it means those who schlep the armor for the king. Right? David was the Nosei Kelim for Shaul. And then the Navi has other places where Nosei Kelim, without exception, whenever the phrase Nosei Kelim, Lahavdil mea elef havdalot. If you ever watched professional golf, the golf, the champion, the caddy, right? The golf champion never schleps his club. He's got a shamus.
How about the installatos in Israel?
Right, so installators always have.
Who doesn't have a helper?
Right, he has a helper. He does the shlepa. Right, the shlepa, bidyuk. So the Nosei Kelim is the shlepa. Exactly, it's the best translation you have, a shlepa. So the Rambam calls Rabbi Akiva the shlepa of Bar Kochba. What does that mean? What does that mean? He's the Nosei Kelim. You think Rabbi Akiva went to battle and he was schlepping the sword of Bar Kochba? No. It means that Rabbi Akiva was his right-hand man and gave halachic vindication for the merid. He said, yeah, let's go for it. Darach kochav mi'akov in Parshat Balak, right? Zu bar Koziba. This was bar Koziba. That's why he called him bar Kochba. On the drasha of Darach kochav, there's going to be a star that's going to rise. And his name was Shimon ben Koziba. He came from Kiziv. And if you look at Rav Goren's article on the birth of Peretz and Zerach, and Peretz is the forerunner of David HaMelech, as we have in the end of Megillat Ruth. So where did this happen? In Kiziv. Vayapik Kiziv belidita otam. And Rav Goren has a whole mahalach, a whole discussion, where it starts from Peretz, goes down to David HaMelech, and goes down to Bar Kochba, and so on. He's Bar Kuziba, and so on. It's phenomenal. So Rabbi Akiva actually believed that Bar Kochba was the Melech HaMashiach. He actually believed it. And he believed that we're going to revolt against Rome, and we're going to have an independent Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael, and we're going to build Beit HaMikdash. And do you know that Bar Kochba for 3 years was an independent king? They minted coins. Go to the museum and you'll see coins. Shimon Nasi Yisrael. The word Nasi means Melech. He was Nasi Yisrael. He was king. Unfortunately, it all collapsed. But they already had plans of building the third Beit HaMikdash. And this is how the Rambam understood Yemot HaMashiach. But he was killed. Bar Kochba was killed, and Beitar, and so on. So they realized it was over. So what the Rambam is really saying is, if you have a Mashiach, and he's a candidate for Mashiach, and he falls, then he's not Mashiach. So I had a friend in Lubavitcher, a good friend in Beersheba, and I said, well, the Rebbe died. So, I mean, if you don't believe he died, that's one thing. But if you believe he died, okay, it was a good try, I didn't have anybody better to suggest for Yemot HaMashiach 40 years ago. But if he's no longer with us, he's no longer with us. So the fellow told me that he will come up with Tchiat HaMeitim, because the Ramban says the Yemot HaMashiach and Tchiat HaMeitim. Okay, that you want to fall on the Ramban's view, that's okay. I said it, but if it's already Tchiat HaMeitim, why shouldn't it be David HaMelech? Why should it be Menachem Schneerson? It should be already David HaMelech. If we're already, playing the Tchiat HaMeitim card, so it should be David HaMelech. So this fellow tells me that the neshama of the Lubavitcher Rebbe was a Gilgul, was a reincarnated neshama of David HaMelech. I said, all right, we're up to Gilgul Neshamot. This discussion has ended. Rambam doesn't know from Gilgul. And, yeah.
Or Gilgul doesn't have to come from Shevet Yigdal? Was the Lubavitcher Rebbe?
He was a Yisrael. He wasn't a Kohen or Levi.
Wait.
The Lubavitcher Rebbe was a Yisrael. David HaMelech from Shevet Yehuda was Yisrael. Yeah, it could have been. It could have been. Look, there's a claim that the Rashi had lineage to David HaMelech. So, look, you have to bring it back to the second Beit HaMikdash. And look, most of the kings in the second Beit HaMikdash were not necessarily Malchut Beit David. They were actually from Shevet Levi. The Chashmonaim were Kahanim. And that's one of the big gripes that the Ramban had against the Chashmonaim, that what they did was perfect, 100%. And then they should have announced, we are withdrawing from the throne and inviting to take our place members of the Davidic line. But they didn't do that. I don't know one politician today that would do something like that, and they didn't do it in Bayit Sheni either. Beseda. So you have Rambam telling us that Melech HaMashiach will come in a natural process, a very natural process. Furthermore, in Ilchas Chanukah, if I mentioned already the Chashmonaim, the Rambam, when he talks about the Chashmonaim, he said they restored Malchut Yisrael for almost 200 years until the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. Now the Rambam knew also that many of the Chashmonaim kings were not the greatest. He knew it brought us all the way down to Hordus. But there's nothing negative in that comment. The Chozra Malchut Yisrael Kov l'mea shana ad ha'churban hasheni. 200 shana, he says, 200 years. It's a positive statement. It's certainly not negative. If anything, it's neutral. Did not the Rambam forget that the Chashmonaim kings were Shevet Levi, they were Kahanim, and that some of them were degenerates? Yanai HaMelech sent the Sanhedrin to Galut, to Mitzrayim, including his own brother-in-law, Shimon ben Shetach, and they were restored by the next king, who was a woman, right? Shlom Tzion HaMalkah was the wife of Yanai HaMelech. I always wondered why the city of Yerushalayim decided to honor Yanai HaMelech with a street. I mean, it's Shlom Tzion HaMalka gets the tail end of Rehov Yafo, which is a nice street. But little off to the little curved street, it's Yanei HaMelech. It's perfect. It's curved and it's short. You couldn't get a better street for Yanei HaMelech. Mamash kach. It was perfect. But there were degenerates there in Beit Sheni, up at the Hordes for sure. And so why does Rambam speak positively about it? Because he wants to say that an independent Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael, even with degenerates leading it, is better than being subjugated to the Greeks or the Romans. That's what he's saying. And if you have a different shot in the Rambam, stand up and tell me, because you'll be wrong. That's what the Rambam's saying. The Rambam believed that Galut, which includes being subjugated, and he says one of the key component parts of Yemot HaMashiach, Ein bein olam hazeh Yemot HaMashiach, ela shi'abud malchiot bilvad, to be subjugated by foreign power. That is a key component. And when you achieve Jewish independence in Eretz Yisrael, you're on the road to some type of geula. It may or may not develop into full geula, but you're on the road. And the Rambam saw Hanukkah as a possibility. And the Rambam saw Bar Kokhba as a possibility. One of the reasons that I make a big deal about the Noise Kalim phrase in the Rambam, because this has to do with the Avelut of Sfirat HaOmer, where if you just open up a Gemara, Masechet Yevamot, you find that the students of Rabbi Akiva died in an epidemic, whether it was corona or something else. The Gemara calls it askara, some type of infectious disease that was contagious, and so on, so on, so on, so on. And you don't go further from that. But there happens to be another source of that period of time. It's the letter of Rav Shrira Gaon, the father of Rav Hai Gaon, end of the 9th century. And he reports that actually what happened was they died in a shmad. Now shmad today sometimes means that somebody convinced you not to be Jewish or converted you to another religion, shmad. But shmad in the words of Chazal also means died because you were Jewish, which means you were killed al Kiddush Hashem. And what Rav Shrira Gaon is actually saying is they fell in the Bar Kokhba war as students, as chayalim, as soldiers of Bar Kokhba, sent by Rabbi Akiva. And I think the Rambam is alluding to this fact by referring to Rabbi Akiva as the Nosei Kelim of Bar Kokhba. Nosei Kelim is exclusively used in the military sense, and it gives Rabbi Akiva a hand in the military. And what ultimately happened was they died. They unfortunately perished, fell in the battle. All of the students of Rabbi Akiva, as the whole army of Bar Kokhba fell in battle. And the Gemara in Masechet Yevamot wants to know why the Bar Kokhba revolution collapsed. And the answer was because the students of Rabbi Akiva did not have basic respect for one another. And that was sinat chinam. If the students of Rabbi Akiva couldn't respect each other, what do you expect from people on the street? And if what brought down Beit HaMikdash, the second Beit HaMikdash, was sinat chinam, Rabbi Akiva had to answer the question. This was 65 years after the destruction. Did we solve the problem of sinat chinam? And the Gemara says, no, we did not. And that's why it collapsed. That's why the Bar Kokhba revolution collapses. This is a thought on my part that the use of the clay. What Rambam says here, he was the Nosei Kelim of Bar Kokhba. But what's important here is the Rambam believes that it's a natural evolution of events, and he says the following. He says we do not have a precise date or era when it might happen. What's going to come first? Is it going to be kibbutz goliot, people will come back first, and then Mashiach will come, or maybe the other way around? Rambam says there's no tradition on this. The Nevi'im contradict each other. One Navi says this, one Navi says that. The Chachamim have contradictory views on this as well. Everything is up in the air. He says, V'lo yada adam ma yiyu ad shiyu. Nobody's going to know what happens until it happens. He basically says, sit tight, hope for the best. And you have to believe that it's going to happen. It necessarily will happen. But the question is, should we be doing something about it or not? And here comes the line of the Yigdal. So in the Yigdal, where it says, Yishlach leketz hayamin mishirkeinu, Liftot mechakei kates, those who are waiting for the end. And in the Ani Ma'amin, which you know already, the Rambam didn't write that too. It's another poetic rendition. If you look at the bottom of this page, and this is the famous song, Ani Ma'amin be'emunah shlema v'tashmiach, v'av al pi sheyitmamea im kol zeh achakelo b'chol yom sheyavo. I want to open up Habakkuk, Perek Bet. Most people never heard of Habakkuk, right? Unless those people who know Navi, because it's a Haftarah, so you remember from Chutz La'aretz, it's the Haftarah of the second day of Shavuos, but it's the third parak of Habakkuk. But here, in the second parak of Habakkuk, it says, and the first is going to be an idiomatic expression that we use today, Od Chazon Lamoed. Many times we say, hang in there, it's going to happen, just be patient. Ki Od Chazon Lamoed, V'yafech l'kates v'lo yichazef. You won't be disappointed that the end will come. Im yitmamea, if you think it's being delayed, chakelo ki bo yavo lo yacher. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. So from this phrase yitmamea, im yitmamea, chakelo. So this poet says ve'af al pi sheyitmamea im kol zeh. So there are those who have suggested that the Rambam is saying we should sit tight and do nothing and just wait. Because waiting seems to be a passive gesture. And he does say, if you look at the last page, Hayasoda Shnei Masar, Yemot Mashiach, V'hu la'amin u'la'amed sheyavo, ve'en lomar sheyit acher. Don't say, it's just going to be late and late and late. Im yitmamea chakelo. So you see, the Rambam is using this phrase lifted out of Habakkuk Perek Bet. Even if he's the delayed, you think he's delaying, wait for him. Ve'ein likbo ozman. Don't sit and calculate when exactly it's going to happen. By the way, throughout history, people have engaged in that endeavor. You take the Abarbanel, who in 1506, he said in 1492, at the time of the expulsion, that Mashiach will come in 1506, and he had all kinds of proofs to it. So what happened in 1506? And Mashiach didn't come. He said, I made a mistake. It's 1521. What he did was he was buying time. He was giving people the hope that it's around the corner. Because if you're in 1492 and you hear Mashiach's coming in 1506, so maybe you're going to hang in there. And it didn't happen in 1506, 1521. By then, there'll be a new era of Am Yisrael, and so on. It was just a tactic. Did he know when Mashiach's coming? No, he said it. And some people also, they come up with all kinds of gematrias and this and that. The Rambam says, don't do it. It's foolish, very foolish. Foolish on a practical level because you're never really going to have the right answer. And foolish on a psychological because you're going to be very disappointed at the end of the day. And it can cause a lot of leaving of Am Yisrael. Shabtai Tzvi. There were so many people who went along with Shabtai Tzvi. And Shabtai Tzvi comes along because of the 1648 pogroms, the Chmielnicki pogroms. Am Yisrael was down and out. It was a mini Shoah. It's not a small number that 100,000 Jews were murdered in a year and a half. And they made a Tanit Tzibur on the 20th of Sivan for that. People were ready for a Melech HaMashiach. Boy, were they ready. At the end of the day, Shabtai Tzvi in Gaza, he becomes a Muslim. He becomes a Muslim at the end of the day. And it was a big disappointment. But there were plenty of Gedolei Yisrael who actually thought, well, maybe this is it, and so on. And what led the Satmar, the whole concept of Turei Karta, even before, in the 19th century, to be so anti-Zionist, devoutly anti-Zionist. The only difference between the Satmar and the Aguda after the state was established was the Satmar kept going with the same theology, but an Aguda backed off a little bit and said, all right, now we have a state, so we'll cooperate on some level. But the Satmar kept it going because they felt that after the Shoah, this was just another messianic movement, the State of Israel. No different than Shabtai Tzvi, was they're going to have no future, and so on. And one of his proofs was, Achakelo, you have to sit and wait, and wait, and wait. You're not allowed to lift your finger to do anything. Except the Rambam thought otherwise. The same Rambam who said Chakelo, he didn't mean Chakelo, sit back and do nothing. He means wait with great anticipation, but the fact that he gives the green light to Melech HaMashiach, to Bar Kochba, is in itself a vindication of proactive stance. The Rambam believes that we're supposed to do whatever we can do to bring it about. And there are many writings in the Rambam to this effect, by the way. It's not just the idea of Bar Kochba, but Bar Kochba is a phenomenal proof. And therefore, Ava Pishiyat Mamea. My grandfather Shalom used to say, it's Chaval, they say, there's an opinion that Melech Mashiach will come on a donkey. If it would have said a Mercedes, it would have been a little bit faster, all right, the donkey. But the Maral Miprag explains that the word Chamor comes from the word Chomriyut, material life. And the Melech HaMashiach will come in a natural progression of events. So indeed, the Gemara Masechet Sanhedrin in Daf Tzadikhet tells us a pasuk that we're going to read as one of the Haftarot after Tisha B'Av in Parshat Ki Tavo, where it says, Ani Hashem bi'ita achishana. I will come in its time, I will hasten. So Gemara says that's an oxymoron. If it's in its time, where's the hastening? If it's hastened, it's not in its time. So Gemara says, Zachu achishana, lo zachu bi'ita. There could be two scenarios. If Am Yisrael does tshuva, and all Am Yisrael does tshuva, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu pushes the fast forward button, and we get the Mother Mashiach, achishana. If not, it's going to happen anyway, but it's going to take its sweet time, bi'ita, in its time. Apparently, that's where we are, in its time. And it started in the late 19th century with the revival of agriculture in Eretz Yisrael. I quote Rabbi Gold, Zechron Lebracha, 100,000 times, right? Where he says that if you want to talk to God, go to the Kotel. If you want to see God, go to Shuk Machne Yehuda and see the agriculture in Eretz Yisrael. Right? Vatem harei Yisrael anpachem titenu ferichem tis'u lami Yisrael ki kervu lavo. The revival of agriculture. And the Chazal say, that's why we say Barech Aleinu, which is the bracha, revival of agriculture in Eretz Yisrael, before Tekab Shofar Gadol Chayotenu, before the ingathering of exiles. And then comes the next stages, which will be Binyan Yerushalayim and coming in Mashiach. So it's natural, it's happening. Slowly. So I'll just end with the great homiletic thought of my son Eitan, who said, Ani Hashem bi'ita achishena. You can read the word bi'ita not with a taf, but rather with a tet. It means a kick. When Am Yisrael gets a kick in the behind, then they're going to start moving. And unfortunately, there's a lot of truth to that. Right, we have a niece coming on Aliyah next month with our family from Teaneck, New Jersey. And once I spoke in Teaneck by my brother, and I said, Valama nikra shma Teaneck, Kulam Teaneck Shanishba. They're all Teaneck Shanishba in Teaneck Shanishba, right? And we asked her, why are you coming? She said, October 7th. October 7th. Am Yisrael sometimes gets a kick, and it jolts people into Achishena to start making the move. I wish that the reasons for people to come to Eretz Yisrael would be a full appreciation of Kedushat Haaretz and so on, and everything that entails with Kedushat Haaretz. But unfortunately, not everybody is pulled by that, but they're pulled by other things, as Rav Kook said in the famous drasha of the three sounds of the shofar, and sometimes it's the shofar of the behemat me'ah, it's the shofar of anti-Semitism that's going to give people that kick, that bi'ita. And God should give us this coming Tisha B'Av, that it should be already part of the Tzom Arvi, which is behind us as a fast. But the Tzom HaChamishi, the fast of Av, should be LeBeit Yehuda, LeSosonu Simcha, UleMoadim Tovim. And when we come back in Mitzvah Shem in the month of Elul, it should be a month of Ani LeDodi, Vidodi Li. It should be a month of connecting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And there's another line to it of Ish L'Re'eu Umatanot Levyonim, which is the abbreviation of Elul. We should not only be connected to Kadosh Baruch Hu, but we should be connected one another, of Am Yisrael, of Chesed, of helping. And of course, the last Elul is Ani Le'uman V'ishti Lehoreha. Right? I'm going to Uman, and my wife goes to her parents. But that's a joke. Okay. Should all be well, and we'll see you then.